Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf is primarily about the rules of psak, how you decide which opinion to follow in the case of disputes. We get into it because we start discussing the Mechokes Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanon of our last daf and determining who the halacha is like. The Gemara tries to give sources. The Gemara gets into the rules of Yachid v'Rabim, a single person against the individual. The Gemara tries to prove whether that rule applies by Derabbanons as well as the Eraisas. And then the Gemara gets into other rules of who we paskin, like specific names when they're against each other, and what level do we paskin. Do we confidently paskin or only b'diavad or some circumstances like that? And of course we have challenges to the rules of psak as well. So the Gemara begins with the psak halacha and the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanon. We're going to have a quote of the psak, a discussion as to where we could have learned this psak from, two sources for the same psak, why we need both of them, and that'll take us into a lengthy discussion as to whether a machlokes between a group and an individual, Yachid v'Rabim, should automatically have a halacha like the Rabim, even in the case of a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. So first of all, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri had a machlokes with the Rabbanon about two things: a person sleeping at the beginning of Shabbos or an inanimate object that's hefker at the beginning of Shabbos. The question is, do they get a kinyan shvisa? Do they get a permanent residence for Shabbos with a 2,000 amma radius all around them in which their tchum extends? According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, yes, they do, and therefore they can both go 2,000 amas and only 2,000 amas. According to the Chachamim, they do not, and therefore a person is stuck in his 4 amas. An inanimate object goes with the tchum of whoever picks it up. That could be longer than 2,000 amas, because if he's on the end of his tchum, he could carry it all the way back to the other side of his tchum, which would be 4,000 amas. So there is a leniency and a stringency either way. The Gemara says, what's the halacha? So the Gemara quotes Rav Yaakov bar Idi, who quoted Rav Yeshua ben Levi, said, the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So Rav Zera said, did you hear that explicitly from him? Did he say that Allah is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, or did he say something else and you're guessing based on that? So he said, no, I heard him explicitly say that Allah is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Gemara says, what else could have been the source? What else did he say that you may have thought was the indication? Where did he non-explicitly say something which would seem to say that? What was Rabbi Zera referring to? The Gemara says he's referring to a statement of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who said that in Hilchas Eruvin we always go lenient. We always go l'kula. So the Gemara says, okay, well, that does seem to indicate that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that a person has 2,000 amas in every direction if he was asleep when Shabbos began. We don't say that he's stuck to his 4 amas if he's outside the city. So Gemara says, well, why does Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi have to say the same psak twice? In one instance he says the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and in another instance he says you go lenient. That's the same psak. Obviously, the Gemara could have answered that when you're saying generally the halacha is always lenient, it applies to a lot of other cases than this. But the Gemara doesn't give that answer, and the Rishonim discuss why the Gemara did not give that answer. What other answers could there have been? So, the Gemara explains each statement one by one why it was needed. The Gemara says if he would have only said the halacha like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, I would have thought that is even in his stringency, even that an inanimate object is limited to 2,000 amas and it can't go further all the way to the end of the tchum of the person who picks it up. And if he would have only said that the halacha is like the one who is lenient in Hilchas Eruvin, besides for all the other leniencies that you would have had out of that, I would have thought that the halacha is lenient in Hilchas Eruvin only in a case where you have a yachid against a yachid, an individual against an individual, or a rabbim against a rabbim, equal footing. Here you have a yachid against a rabbim, you have a Yochanan ben Nuri against a chachamim. I would think that there you don't go leniently. That's what he has to tell me. No, even in this discussion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the chachamim, we still go leniently, even though the lenient opinion is the individual. So Gemara says that doesn't necessarily hold. The Gemara says that Rav Papa asked Rava. This is an issue of a Derabbanon. This is Eruvin. In a Derabbanon, where did you ever see that there's a difference between a Yachid and a Rabbim? Where do you ever see that they're considered to be not equal footing and you always paskin like the Rabbim? That's not true. So Gemara brings a couple of examples of where you do see that. The Gemara says, first of all, in Hilchos Nida, the halacha is that a woman who becomes Nida has a menstrual flow. Anything that she touched after the blood began to flow is tameh, including truma or taharas, all those things. They become tameh and they have to be destroyed. The question is, when she finds the blood, how do you know that there wasn't a drop of blood somewhere in the outer areas that is already metame her, even though she didn't find it yet? So midirabanan, you have to assume that 24 hours previous to when she found the blood was already flowing, and anything she touched within 24 hours of when she finds the blood is tameh as well. Now, question that is discussed between Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanon. There's your Yachid and your Rabbin. The question is, what about a woman who has not seen blood for 3 months? 3 complete cycles have gone by without anything. So Rabbi Elazar says that if that happens to her, she's assumed to be not bleeding. She's assumed to be having a ceased cycle. And therefore, whenever she starts to see a blood again, you don't have to go back 24 hours. You could assume it came just at that moment. She was bechezkas misulekes. Now, that's Rabbi Elazar's opinion, is that applies to all women, whatever stage of life they're in. According to the Chachamim, that's only true of a woman who's already in a menopausal age, and it would make sense to say that she stopped seeing blood altogether. But if it's a young woman, you wouldn't be able to say that. So, again, the machokis is a young woman who saw blood and touched truma within 24 hours. Is that truma tahar or tami? That's machokis. Rabbi Elazar would say if 3 months went by, it's tahar, and the Chachamim would say it's tami. So the Gemara says that an incident happened, exactly this case, and the question came before Rebbe, and he paskined like Rebbe Elazar, who was the individual. So Gemara says that later he remembered, and he said, oh no, I made a mistake. And he said, you know what, we could rely on Rebbe Elazar in a Shas Adchak. He did not want to make the food a tameh because it was a hunger year and there wasn't enough food. So he said, listen, it's a Shas Adchak, it's extenuating circumstances, we'll rely on Rebbe Elazar's opinion. So the Gemara says he remembered. What do you mean he remembered? He remembered that we paskin the halacha is like the Chachamim. If that would be the case, then he couldn't say, well, rely on Rebbe Elazar. You can't, we paskin and not that way. So it must be what he remembered was that there was no psak. But that the one who argues on Rebbe Elazar is not an individual, it's not a one against one, it's a one against the many. It's a Yachid V'Rabim. And yet, he still said that the halacha is that we're going to, even though the halacha is like the Chachamim, we're supposed to go like the Chachamim, we could rely on Rebbe Elazar because it's a Shas Adchak. That clearly implies, had it not been a Shas Adchak, he would have said that the halacha is like the Chachamim because it's automatically Yachid V'Rabim, Malachik V'Rabim. Now, this is a question of a D'Rabbanan, because being matame anything 24 hours earlier is only a D'Rabbanan issue. D'Oraisa, you don't have to do that. So therefore, you clearly see that even on an issue of a D'Rabbanan, you do give precedence to the many over the one. Gemara now gives another source for the fact that we do have a difference between the Yachid and the Rabbim, the singular, the individual, and the many, even in a question of a D'Rabbanan. And this is in Hilchos Avelus. So we know that the halacha is that somebody finds out that one of his 7 close relatives has passed away, has to keep certain halachas of mourning. There's a lot of restrictions for the first 7 days, that's called Shiva, and then there are lighter restrictions, but still some for the next 30 days. So the Brisa says that's only if he finds out within 30 days of the passing. If he didn't find out that his relative passed away until 30 days after the death, says the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim whether he has to keep Shiva. According to the Chachamim, he has to keep regular Shiva and regular Shloshim. According to Rabbi Akiva, he only has to keep 1 day Shiva, and that's it. Afterwards, it's all over. So Gemara says you have Rabbi Akiva here is going lenient. He's an individual, and you have the many, the Rabbim, are going stringently. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yechanan said, whenever you have a Rabbim going strictly, then you go like the Rabbim. Except for here. Here we go leniently. And we're passing like Rabbi Akiva, and the reason is that Rabbi Yechanan holds like Shmuel, who says that in Hilchos Avelus you always go leniently. So Gemara says, you see, there's only in Hilchos Avelus where you go leniently. Hilchos Avelus is a D'Rabbanan. We didn't say all D'Rabbanans you go leniently. We said in Hilchos Avelus, in the laws of mourning, you go leniently. Implication is clearly that in other laws, even though they would be D'Rabbanan, as long as they're not Avelus, we would not rule leniently like the individual. We would go like the Rabbim. So again, there's your proof that when you have a Rabbim against the Yachid, even on an issue of a D'Rabbanan, you would still rule like the Rabbim. The Gemara now reverts back to the topic of the 2 statements of Yeshua ben Levi. One, he said that the halacha is always leniently in Hilchos Eruvin, and then he still felt the need to say that the halacha is like Rabbi Yechanan ben Nuri about the original creation of an Eruv Techumin, of a Tchum on a person who's asleep. and on inanimate objects. Why did he have to add that if the halacha is lenient? If he already said the halacha is lenient in Hilchas Eruvin. So the Gemara offers two more answers. Rav Papa says, if he would have just said the halacha is lenient in Hilchas Eruvin, I would have thought that's referring to Eruv Chatzeiros, not necessarily Eruv Tchumin. Therefore, he has to tell me Eruv Tchumin. The Gemara says, who says there's a difference between Chatzeros and Tchumin? Why would I think that Chatzeros is more lenient than Tchumin? The Gemara says, because we find a Mishnah that differentiates between the two. The Mishnah says, are you allowed to set up an Eruv for somebody without his knowledge? So it says, in Eruv Chatzeros you're allowed to, because you are giving him a piece of bread, you're being mezake it to him, you are making it his without his knowledge, and that makes him able to carry within others' yards or shared yards. He doesn't lose anything, and you're allowed to do something that somebody is not aware of for him if he doesn't lose. However, Tchumin, if you are going to give him food, be mezake food to him, you're going to transfer ownership of food to him without him even being aware of it, and making an Eruv Tchumin, what ends up happening is that now he's limited, because his center of Tchum is where you set it up, and he cannot travel in the opposite direction as far as he would have liked to. So you are restricting him, and therefore you can't do that. So you see that there are more leniencies in Chatzeros than there are in Tchumin, and I might think that this is true here as well. The Gemara now gives a second answer. The Gemara says, if you would have only told me that we go leniently in Erev, and not that the Lach is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, I would have thought, says Rav Ashi, that the lenience is only when you are you're dealing with an Erev that was created already properly, and now the question is it still kosher? But here, where you're creating an Erev in the first place, I would think you don't go leniently. Okay, the Gemara says, where do you see that there's difference between those? The Gemara says, that's clear. There's a Mishnah that says that you have to have a minimum size of bread, you have to have 2 meals worth when you're setting up an Erev Tchumen in the first place. But if you set it up correctly, and then part of the food was destroyed or disappeared, it's okay as long as you have something left. And the reason is that you don't really need any size for Eruvin. The Gemara here is referring now to Erev Chatzeros, not Erev Tchumen. You don't need a minimum size. The only reason why there's a minimum size for an Erev Chatzeros is because there's a minimum size for an Erev Tchumen, and we don't want people to get confused and forget that there's supposed to be a minimum size for Erev Tchumen. That there is a minimum size. So that halachically there is. Chatzeros is just so that you remember Tchumen. Therefore, if you made an Erev Chatzeros correctly and you lost part of the food, as long as you have something left, that's okay. There, we don't hold you to the minimum size then, as long as you did it correctly in the first place. Having mentioned some of the rules of Psak, the Gemara now launches into general rules of how we paskin in the case of certain machloksim. So the Gemara gives a couple of rules here. The Gemara says, first of all, Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Zrika gave the following rule. Rabbi Akiva is the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva against any other yachid. Halacha Rabbi Akiva mechaveroi, against any other individual. If it's 1-on-1, Rabbi Akiva wins. But Rabbi Yosi beats anybody, even a rabbin. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi also has halacha like him against any other individual. So Gemara asks, when we say the halacha is like them here, in these three, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yosi, and Rabbi, what do we mean? We mean that you could actually paskin based on that? Or we mean something else? So the Gemara gives 3 offerings as to what we mean here. Rav Asi says, yes, we actually paskin. Chiya Rabba says, no, you can't paskin that way, for you cannot give a shir in the Beis Medrash in public to say that that's the halacha, but if an individual comes and asks you, you could tell him to do like those. And then the Gemara's third explanation here is Yaisi Rabbi Chanina. He says, no, you don't paskin that way, but b'di'eved, if you already did by mistake, you could rely on it. You don't have to change the psak. Okay, now the Gemara gives more rules. Rabbi Yaakov bar Yidis and Rabbi Yochanan. If it's Rabbi Meir against Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. If it's Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Yosi, the halacha is like Rabbi Yosi. And therefore, obviously, if it's Rabbi Meir against Rabbi Yosi, the halacha is going to be like Rabbi Yosi. Now the Gemara says, what about Rav Asi asks, what about Rav Shimon and Rabbi Yosi? So the Gemara says the halacha is definitely like Rabbi Yosi, because we see that Rav Shimon loses even to Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda lost to Rabbi Yosi, so Rav Shimon also does. The question is, what about Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Meir? Both of those, the halacha is not like them if it's against Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yosi, so what if they're against each other? And that the Gemara says, Teiku, we do not have a bottom line on that. Okay, these are all the rules that are laid out. Now the Gemara says, not everybody agrees to these rules. Rav Misharshi says all these rules are wrong. What's your source? How does Rav Misharshi know that all these are wrong? So simply, he's going to find the case where you have a machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, and the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, which goes against these rules, showing that they are wrong. There are two cases which we're going to bring, and the Gemara will reject them both for the same reason. In both, it is clearly said that the halacha is like Reb Shimon, and it could be that the rule is only meant to apply in a case where there's no clear psak that's given. But if there's a clear psak that's given, the rules were never said. What are the two cases? So one is discussing 3 courtyards near each other, all in a row. Each one opens to Rosh Hashanah. We had this on the daf yesterday. And the middle courtyard made an Eruv Chatzeres with the outer 2. So he's permitted to use theirs, they're permitted to use his, but the 2 outer guys are not permitted to use them. That's Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, the Gemara says, and the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon. So you see halacha like Rabbi Shimon over Rabbi Yehuda, the Gemara says, no, that's where it's said explicitly, but where it's not said, then the rule generally is like Rabbi Yehuda. Fine, what's the second case? Second case is a bit more complex. It's talking about a city which does not qualify as Rosh Hashanah because of various factors other than the number of people there. The city, the streets are too narrow, whatever it is, it can't be a Rosh Hashanah. But it may have 60,000, it may have 600,000 people in it. The halacha is that a Rosh Hashanah, you cannot make one Eruv Chatzeres or Shitufei Mavois, which is the same idea, just with streets. You cannot make that in Rosh Hashanah. This city is not Rosh Hashanah. But it's like Rosh Hashanah if it has 600,000 people. It's similar to Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, Chazal were concerned to let you make. They didn't want to let you make a Shitufei Mavois because people may end up making Shitufei Mavois in a real Rosh Hashanah. So here are the rules that they said. They said that if a city was very small, it didn't have 600,000 people, and then at some point it grew, and now it has 600,000, then it's still viewed by people as a small city because it used to be small, and therefore we're not concerned. You can make a Shitufei Mavois there as long as it's not Rosh Hashanah because of other issues, because the streets are too narrow or whatever it is. However, if it was a big city, always a big city, you can't make a Shitufei Mavois there, even though again it's not a Rosh Hashanah for other reasons, but because it's 600,000, it's too easy to confuse, and therefore people are going to end up making a Shitufei Mavois in a real Rosh Hashanah, which is forbidden. Now, even if this big city shrinks, you still can't, because it may come back to its original size, and people will still rely on the Shitufei Mavois, which is not proper and correct. The only thing you can do is leave over part of the city not in the Shitufei Mavois, so that people will remember and not rely on it when it grows again. So this is a machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says he can't make an Eruv Chatzeres at all, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's enough if you leave over a little bit of the city. You leave over 3 courtyards with 2 houses in each of them. That's Reb Shimon is the Mekel, Rabbi Yehuda is the Machmer. And here we say the halacha is like Reb Shimon, and Gemara again says it doesn't prove that the rules are wrong. The rules are only said where the halacha is not clearly.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.